The Vampire King invited his rejected Barren mate to his heir ceremony to humiliate her. He expected tears. Instead, Morella returned with 4 orphaned princes from erased houses, forged into her own army. In front of the entire court, she makes one promise: you will never separate my family again. Before we see what happens when next, where are you watching this story from right now? Drop a quick comment and remember to hit that subscribe button. The carriage wheels ground against ancient cobblestone, a rhythm like a heartbeat returning to a body that had learned to live without it. Morella Corvash sat motionless in the velvet darkness, her spine pressed against the seat with the rigid composure of someone who had spent 3 years learning not to break. At 31, she had the kind of beauty that cruelty had refined rather than destroyed: sharp cheekbones that caught lamplight like blades, dark eyes that had learned to hold secrets, hands that no longer trembled when they signed her own name. Those hands rested now in her lap, fingers laced together with deliberate calm. But inside her chest, something ancient and wounded was waking up. The obsidian citadel rose in the distance, black spires cutting into the twilight sky like claws. She had sworn she would never see it again. Had promised herself that the woman who fled through these gates 3 years ago, publicly named Barren, her womb declared a betrayal to the bloodline by her own mate, had died the moment she crossed into exile. Yet here she was, returning. The invitation lay folded in her coat pocket, the parchment so elegant it felt obscene. You are cordially invited to witness the presentation ceremony of the royal heir. As if courtesy could disguise the blade. As if King Cashin Valor hadn't known exactly what those words would do to her. Look at the heirs I have now. Look at the legacy you could never secure. Come and witness your own failure made manifest. She should have burned it. Should have let him win by staying invisible. Instead, she'd packed her belongings and called for her sons. A low voice broke the silence. Mother, your pulse is accelerating. Morella turned her head slightly. Across from her, seated with the controlled stillness of a coiled weapon, Prince Darien Corvash watched her with eyes the color of winter steel. At 19, he was the eldest, broad-shouldered and severe, his dark hair pulled back to reveal the sharp angles of a face that had never learned softness. The sigil ring on his finger bore the shattered crest of House Telmore, a bloodline destroyed by political treachery 2 decades prior. He had been 12 when she found him. Feral. Starving. The last living scion of a house the Coven had erased from history. Now he sat before her like a blade she had spent 7 years sharpening. I'm fine, Morella said quietly. You're lying. This voice came from her left, Prince Orion Corvash, 17, leaner and quicker than his brother, with copper-bright eyes that missed nothing. He sprawled in his seat with deceptive laziness, but his fingers drummed a restless pattern against his knee. The mark of House Solis burned faint and silver along his collarbone, a bloodline stripped of its titles after a failed coup. Your heartbeat sounds like war drums. Morella allowed herself a thin smile. Then perhaps it knows where we're going. Good. The third voice was a purr of anticipation. Prince Lucien Corvash, 16, sat beside Orion with the kind of beauty that made people forget he was dangerous. His black hair fell across one eye, and his mouth curved in a smile that never quite reached his gaze. House Ashran blood ran through his veins, a lineage accused of heresy and burned from the records. Let them hear you coming. The youngest, Prince Valen Corvash, 15, said nothing. He simply reached across the carriage and placed his hand over Morella's. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. The sigil of House Kirin, a family decimated by plague and paranoia, glowed faint beneath his collar. His silence had always been his strength. Morella looked at each of them in turn. For sons. Not of her blood. Not of her body. But hers in every way that mattered. She had found them scattered across the realm, survivors of houses the Coven had destroyed, discarded, forgotten. She had taken them in not out of pity, but recognition. They were what she had become, proof that the system was broken. and she had made them a promise the night she adopted each one. You will never be powerless again. The carriage began to slow. Through the window, Morella watched the citadel's outer walls rise like a black throat ready to swallow them whole. Darien shifted forward. The plan remains unchanged? Yes. Morella's voice was iron. We enter together. We do not hide. We do not apologize. And we do not speak to him in private. And when he tries to separate us? Oren's eyes gleamed. Morella smiled, and this time it had teeth. Then he'll learn what it costs to underestimate a barren woman. The carriage door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of old stone and older power. A liveried servant stood beside the steps, his face carefully blank, but his eyes widened when he saw the 4 figures rising behind Morella. She stepped down first, her cloak sweeping across marble that had once known her footsteps. The grand courtyard was exactly as she remembered, obsidian columns, silver torches burning with cold flame, and everywhere, the weight of watching eyes. The Coven elite had already gathered. Nobles in their ancient finery, advisors with smiles like knives, courtiers who had whispered about her dead womb and failed bloodline as if she couldn't hear them. They were staring now. Morella heard the intake of breath. The stunned silence. The ripple of shock moving through the crowd like wind through wheat. Because she was not alone. Darien emerged first, stepping down with the presence of a born heir, his hand resting casually on the pommel of a sword no rejected prince should be allowed to carry. Orion followed, his movements liquid and precise, every inch the predator. Lucien descended with a smile that made several nobles take an involuntary step back. And Valen, silent and watchful, moved to Morella's side like a shadow that had learned to stand in the light. The whispers began. That's House Talmer's crest. Impossible. That bloodline was destroyed. 4 of them, she has 4. How did she? An older woman, Duchess Coralise, clutched her fan so hard it snapped. She was barren, she hissed to the man beside her, too loud, too shrill. The king himself declared her. Barren, yes. Morella turned her head slowly, meeting the Duchess's horrified gaze. Her voice carried across the courtyard with perfect, lethal clarity. Incapable of bearing the king's heirs. But no one ever said I couldn't choose my family. The Duchess went pale. Morella turned back toward the citadel's main entrance, where golden light spilled from the throne room beyond. Her heart was a war drum. Her hands were steady. Behind her, her 4 sons moved as one, a united, unbreakable wall. Let's go, Morella said softly. It's time King Cassian Valor met the family he never imagined I could build. And together, they walked into the palace that had once cast her out, no longer the broken consort, but something the Coven had never seen before. A mother who had turned rejection into an army. Subscribe now to see what happens when Morella confronts the king. The throne room stretched before them like the gullet of some ancient beast, vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, columns of polished obsidian reflecting torchlight in fractured gold, and at the far end, elevated on a dais of black marble, King Cassian Valor held court. He hadn't seen her yet. Morella's breath caught despite herself. 3 years had done nothing to diminish him. He sat with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been denied, one hand draped across the armrest, the other holding a crystal goblet that caught the light like frozen blood. His dark hair fell just past his collar, and, even from this distance, she could see the sharp beauty of his face, the kind that made people forget he was capable of cruelty until it was too late. At his side, draped in silk the color of fresh cream, stood Lady Severin, the new consort. Younger than Morella by at least 5 years, with porcelain skin and golden hair arranged in elaborate braids. And cradled in her arms, swaddled in royal blue, was the heir. The child Morella's body had failed to provide. The sight should have destroyed her. 3 years ago, it would have. Now, Morella felt only cold clarity. She moved forward, her sons falling into formation behind her, not servants, not shadows, but an honor guard that commanded the space around them with silent authority. The crowd parted instinctively, nobles stepping aside as if the four princes carried their own gravity. King Cashin was mid-sentence, discussing some trivial matter of tax policy with an elderly advisor, when his words faltered. His head tilted slightly, the way a predator senses something wrong in the air. His fingers tightened on the goblet. Then his entire body went rigid. Morella watched as awareness moved through him like lightning through water. His pupils dilated. His jaw tensed. And then, slowly, so slowly it felt like violence, he turned his head toward the entrance. Their eyes met across the length of the throne room. For one heartbeat, Cashin's expression was utterly, beautifully blank. Shock stripped away every carefully constructed mask, leaving only the raw fact of her existence standing before him when she should have been broken, hidden, gone. Then his gaze moved past her. To Darien. To Orion. To Lucien and Valen. Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. He rose from the throne in a single fluid motion, handing his goblet to a servant without looking. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of command that had bent kingdoms. Lady Morella. Not consort. Not even her married name. Just the formal address of a stranger. This is unexpected. Is it? Morella's voice was silk over steel. She continued forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps. You sent an invitation, Your Majesty. I merely accepted. Cashin descended the dais, and the court held its collective breath. He moved with the predatory grace she remembered, every step a calculated display of dominance. The air itself seemed to thicken with power, the ancient, crushing weight of a vampire king asserting his territory. But before he could reach Morella, Darien stepped forward. The movement was silent, effortless, but the intent was unmistakable. Darien didn't speak, didn't draw a weapon. He simply placed himself between Morella and the king, his winter steel eyes meeting Cashin's crimson gaze with absolute, unwavering defiance. The sigil of House Talmor gleamed at his collar, a broken house standing unbroken before the throne. The entire court gasped. Cashin stopped mid-stride. His expression shifted from shock to something darker, more volatile. You bring armed companions into my throne room? His voice dropped to a lethal quiet. Children who bear the crests of traitor houses? I bring my sons. Morella moved to stand beside Darien, then past him, until she stood face to face with the man who had once been her mate. Close enough to see the gold flecks in his crimson eyes. Close enough to smell the wine on his breath. My family, Your Majesty. The one I built after you declared me broken. Cashin's jaw worked. We should discuss this privately. No. The word cut through the air like a blade. Morella smiled, and it was all teeth. You made your judgment of me public, Cashin. You stood before this court and declared my womb a betrayal. You announced to every noble, every advisor, every whispering courtier that I was barren, that my body was a failure. She gestured to the assembled crowd, now watching with rapt, horrified attention. So, let's speak publicly. Let them hear how the king who discarded his mate for failing to produce heirs never once considered that family could be chosen. Behind her, Orion, Lucien, and Valen moved to flank their brother, forming a wall of silent, unified strength. Cashin stared at her, and for the first time in 3 years, Morella saw something she'd never expected in his eyes. Fear. Not of her, but of what she represented. Proof that his cruelty had limits. That his vision had been catastrophically, irreversibly short. You have no right, he began. I have every right, Morella interrupted softly. You gave it to me the night you cast me out. The silence that followed was absolute. The decree arrived at dawn, delivered by a royal messenger who wouldn't meet Morella's eyes. She stood in the doorway of the modest estate she'd claimed on the outskirts of the citadel grounds, far enough from the palace to breathe, close enough that leaving would look like retreat. The parchment was heavy in her hands, sealed with the king's crimson wax, the official mark of the obsidian throne pressed deep into the paper like a brand. Morella broke the seal. The words were clinical, precise, designed to sound reasonable while driving a stake through everything she'd built. By order of King Cassian Valor and in accordance with Coven Law Article 12, Section 4, the individuals currently under the guardianship of Lady Morella Corvash, formerly consort, status revoked, are hereby declared illegitimate political risks to the stability of the realm. Said individuals bear the bloodlines of houses Talmor, Solis, Ashrin, and Kirin, all of which have been legally dissolved due to treason, heresy, or catastrophic failure of lineage obligations. Lady Morella is commanded to withdraw all claims of maternal rights and relinquish custody to the crown for proper evaluation and placement within appropriate noble houses. Failure to comply within 3 days will result in formal charges brought before the Grand Council. Non-compliance will be considered an act of sedition. The parchment crumpled in Morella's fist. Behind her, she heard Darian's footsteps, measured, controlled, but she could feel the rage radiating off him like heat from a forge. "Mother, he's trying to take you." Her voice came out flat. "Dead. All of you. Let him try." Orion appeared at her other side, his copper eyes blazing. "We'll paint the citadel walls with his." "No." Morella turned to face her sons, all 4 of them now gathered in the narrow entrance hall, their faces carved from fury and fear they were too proud to name. "Violence is what he expects. It's the excuse he needs to justify calling you dangerous." She looked down at the decree again, forcing herself to read past the rage. This isn't about protection or stability. It's about control. He can't bear that I built something without his permission. Then what do we do? Valen's quiet voice cut through the tension. "If the Grand Council summons you, they'll use the law to separate us." Morella's hands trembled. She pressed them flat against her sides. "I'm his rejected mate," declared Barren. "I have no legal standing as a mother under Coven law because I never produced an heir through the sanctioned bond. And you," her voice cracked, "you're scions of erased houses. Politically toxic. They'll argue I'm using you for power, that you're being manipulated, that the safest thing is to place you with appropriate families who can rehabilitate your bloodlines." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Lucien laughed, sharp, brittle, vicious. "So we're already convicted. Wonderful." "Not yet." The voice came from the doorway, cultured and dark as smoke. Morella spun. A figure stood framed in the entrance, tall, slender, dressed in black tailored clothing that looked a century out of date. His face was angular and pale, his silver hair pulled back in a neat queue, and his eyes were the color of old parchment. He held a leather case under one arm and a walking stick carved from blackthorn in the other. Darian's hand went to his sword. "Who the hell?" "Solicitor Matthias Kale." The man inclined his head with old-world courtesy. "Specialist in ancient Coven law, constitutional loopholes, and representing the legally inconvenient." His smile was thin and sharp. "I heard about your situation. Thought you might need someone who knows how to fight the Grand Council on their own ground." Morella stared at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because the law they're using against you is the same law that's been crushing people like us for centuries." Kale stepped inside uninvited, his eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. "Rejected mates. Dissolved bloodlines. Anyone who doesn't fit their sterile definition of legitimacy." He set his case on the table and opened it, revealing stacks of documents, maps of legal precedent, annotations in crimson ink. The Coven runs on rules older than most of the nobility can remember. They want you to think those rules are absolute. They're not. Orion moved closer, his predator's curiosity overriding his suspicion. "Nothing's absolute if you know where to look." Kale pulled out a specific document, yellowed with age. "The problem is this. Coven law states that a rejected mate forfeits all rights to produce heirs within the royal lineage. And adoption of noble scions requires approval from the Grand Council if the adoptive parent holds no current political standing. He looked at Morella. You're caught in both traps. No standing because you're rejected. No approval because you acted without permission. Morella's chest tightened. Then how do we win? Kale's smile widened, and for the first time, she saw something dangerous behind his professional veneer. We prove that your family was never subject to coven adoption law in the first place. Because you didn't adopt noble scions. He tapped the document. You created a new house. The room went still. A house can only be created by, Darian's eyes widened, by claiming unclaimed bloodlines and forging them under a single banner with documented intent to restore lost lineage. Exactly. Kale nodded. House Corvash. Not adopted sons. Co-founders of a new political entity. If we can prove you established this house before the king's decree, they can't touch you. You'll have legal standing, and your sons will have protection as founding members of a recognized bloodline. Morella's heart pounded. Can we prove it? That, Kale said quietly, is what we have 3 days to figure out. What legal loophole will Morella use to protect her sons? Share your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe. The library became their war room. Ancient texts covered every surface, legal precedents stacked beside genealogies, coven constitutional amendments spread across floor maps that traced bloodline extinctions like casualty reports. Morella hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the past week. None of them had. Solicitor Kale moved through the chaos with the precision of someone conducting surgery, pulling documents from centuries-old archives, cross-referencing laws that predated the current monarchy. Here, he said, sliding a leather-bound volume toward Darian. House Morven. Established in 1342 after the Plague of Ash. 3 unrelated survivors claimed kinship through shared survival and were granted noble status within 2 years. Darian scanned the text, his jaw tight. The precedent exists. It exists, Kale confirmed. But precedent isn't enough. The Grand Council will argue that House Morven was formed during a crisis that threatened the entire coven's survival. They'll say your situation doesn't qualify. He looked at Morella. We need witnesses who can prove the current system is the crisis. That was how they found Dr. Isla Thorne. The historian arrived 3 days later, a woman so ancient her skin looked like parchment stretched over bird bones, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. She stood in Morella's library surrounded by 4 young princes and didn't flinch. You want me to testify that the pure bloodline doctrine is killing us, she said flatly. Politically inconvenient truth. Can you prove it? Morella asked. Dr. Thorne smiled, and it was ghastly. Child, I've been documenting the extinction rate of noble houses for 200 years. The coven has lost 63 bloodlines in the past century alone. 63. She pulled out a notebook filled with meticulous records. Not from war. Not from plague. From the law itself. Families so obsessed with purity, they bred themselves into sterility, madness, or genetic collapse. Her gaze found Morella. You were called Barren. But the king's own lineage shows signs of chromosomal degradation. In 3 generations, the Valor line will likely produce no viable heirs at all. Lucien let out a low whistle. You're going to tell the council that the king's bloodline is dying. I'm going to tell them the entire system is committing suicide. Dr. Thorne's voice was iron. And that this woman's choice to forge a family from broken lines is the only sensible response to institutional failure. The second witness was harder to secure. Elder Casimir was a member of the Grand Council itself, ancient, politically untouchable, and known for his rigid adherence to tradition. When he arrived under cover of darkness, slipping through Morella's door like a shadow, she nearly didn't believe it. I will testify, he said without preamble, his voice like gravel. Not because I approve of your methods, Lady Morella, but because the alternative is watching the coven die of its own arrogance. He looked at each of the princes in turn. These boys represent bloodlines we destroyed through negligence and paranoia. If we refuse to acknowledge that choosing family might be wiser than enforcing purity, we deserve extinction. Valen, who rarely spoke, asked quietly, "Why risk your position for us?" Elder Casimir's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Because I voted to dissolve House Karen 40 years ago. Your grandfather begged us to reconsider." He looked away. "I've regretted that vote ever since." 2 weeks dissolved into a blur of preparation. Kale drilled them on procedure, on how to address the council, on which legal phrases could save them and which would damn them. Dr. Thorne compiled her evidence into devastating charts. Elder Casimir coached Morella on the political undercurrents, who could be swayed, who was already bought, who would vote against her simply because Cashin demanded it. The night before the trial, Morella found Orion standing alone on the estate's balcony, staring out at the citadel's black spires against the moonless sky. She joined him in silence, the cold air biting through her thin shawl. "We might lose," Orion said finally. His voice was steady, but she heard the tremor underneath. "All of this, the witnesses, the precedents, the laws, they might not be enough." "I know." Morella's throat tightened. "If they separate us," his hands gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. "If they try to send me back to some appropriate House Solis remnant, train me to be respectable, make me forget. They won't." Morella turned to face him, gripping his shoulders. "Even if we lose the trial, Orion, they will never make you forget. None of you. Because what we built isn't written in their laws or their bloodlines. It's written in every choice we made to stand together when the world said we shouldn't exist." Orion's copper eyes met hers, bright with unshed tears. "You really believe that?" "I have to." Morella's voice broke. "Because the alternative is accepting that love and loyalty mean nothing against their rules. And I refuse to believe that." He pulled her into a fierce embrace, and she held him like she'd held all of them, these boys who'd become her sons not through biology, but through defiant, unshakable choice. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we walk into that council chamber with our heads high. Win or lose, we show them what family really means." Orion nodded against her shoulder. "Together. Always." The Coven Council chamber was a monument to intimidation. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow, walls carved from obsidian reflected torchlight like captured screams, and at the far end, 7 elder council members sat elevated on a crescent dais, their faces pale as death masks behind a lattice of silver and bone. Morella walked the length of that chamber with her 4 sons flanking her, their footsteps echoing against stone that had witnessed centuries of judgment. She felt the weight of every eye, nobles packed into the gallery, courtiers whispering behind jeweled fans, and at the prosecution table, King Cashin Valor sitting with the coiled stillness of a serpent prepared to strike. Solicitor Kale gestured them to the defense table. Morella sat, her spine rigid, hands folded in her lap. Darian stood behind her right shoulder, Orion her left, with Lucien and Valen forming a silent wall of defiance. They wore no weapons, but their presence was its own arsenal. The chief elder, a woman so ancient her skin looked translucent, raised one skeletal hand. "This council convenes to address the petition of King Cashin Valor regarding custody and legal status of 4 minor scions currently under the guardianship of Lady Morella Corvash." Her voice carried like wind through a crypt. "Your Majesty, present your case." Cashin rose with the grace of someone who had never doubted his own authority. He didn't look at Morella. That somehow was worse than hatred. "Honored elders," he began, his voice smooth as poisoned wine. "This matter is straightforward. Lady Morella, my former mate, rejected for her inability to fulfill the most basic duty of a consort, has unlawfully claimed custody of 4 noble scions without council approval. These boys represent bloodlines dissolved by this very council due to treason, heresy, and catastrophic failure." He gestured toward the princes with casual dismissal. "House Telmore, destroyed for conspiracy against the throne. House Solis, stripped of titles after an attempted coup. House Ashrin, condemned for heretical practices. House Kirin, lost to plague and madness. Darian's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Cashin continued, each word a calculated strike. Lady Morella has no legal standing as a mother, she produced no heirs, was rejected from the royal bloodline, and holds no political position. She has taken these boys not out of love, but desperation. A barren woman attempting to manufacture relevance by collecting the broken pieces of failed houses. His crimson eyes finally found hers. She is unfit. The boys are political liabilities. For their own safety and the stability of the realm, they must be removed from her influence and placed with appropriate families who can rehabilitate their bloodlines. The silence that followed felt like a noose tightening. Chief Elder gestured to Morella. Lady Corvash. Your response. Morella stood slowly. Her hands trembled, so she pressed them against the table. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried. Honored elders, the king is correct about one thing. I am barren. I could not give him the heir he demanded. She lifted her chin. But this trial isn't about my womb. It's about whether family requires blood, or whether it can be forged through choice. She nodded to Kale, who stood and presented the first document. House Corvash was formally established 3 years ago, immediately following Lady Morella's exile. Documentation shows the intentional creation of a new bloodline through the integration of 4 noble scions whose houses were dissolved, not destroyed. The legal distinction matters. Dr. Thorne rose from the witness section, her ancient frame somehow commanding. I have documented evidence that 63 noble houses have gone extinct in the past century due to the purity doctrine this council enforces. The system is failing. These 4 young men represent powerful bloodlines that the Coven discarded. Lady Morella didn't exploit them, she saved them from the same institutional neglect that's killing us all. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Cashin's expression darkened. Elder Casimir stood from his seat on the council itself, a move so unprecedented that several nobles gasped. I voted to dissolve House Kirin, he said, his voice heavy with decades of regret. I have watched this council prioritize purity over survival, politics over pragmatism. If we punish Lady Morella for choosing loyalty over bloodline, we admit that our laws value sterile tradition more than the future of the Coven itself. The chief elder's expression remained unreadable. King Cashin, your rebuttal. Cashin's composure cracked slightly. This is sentiment disguised as law. Lady Morella violated protocol. Protocol that would have left these boys to die forgotten, Morella interrupted, her voice rising. You want to talk about political risk? Look at what your precious pure bloodlines have produced. Madness. Sterility. Extinction. She gestured to her sons. These 4 have more combined power, more strategic intelligence, more loyalty than half the noble houses in this chamber. I didn't manufacture relevance, Your Majesty. I built a family from the wreckage your system created. Cashin took a step toward her, his power flooding the room like ice water. You built nothing. You collected strays. I chose them. Morella's voice cut through his fury like a blade. The same way you chose to reject me. But my choice created something stronger than your bloodline ever will. Because they chose me back. The chamber erupted into chaos, nobles shouting, council members conferring in urgent whispers, Cashin's face a mask of rage. The chief elder raised her hand, and silence crashed down like a physical weight. This council will deliberate, she said. Clear the chamber. Morella's heart stopped. Beside her, Valen's hand found hers and squeezed. The elders rose and disappeared through a hidden door. Cashin stormed out without looking back. And Morella stood with her sons, waiting for 7 ancient vampires to decide whether love was stronger than law. The waiting was a special kind of torture. 2 hours stretched into eternity while Morella and her sons remained in an antechamber, surrounded by silent guards and the oppressive weight of centuries-old stone. No one spoke. Darian paced like a caged wolf. Orion sat with his head in his hands. Lucien's usual smirk had vanished, replaced by raw anxiety. Valen stood beside Morella, his hand never leaving hers. When the summons finally came, Morella's legs nearly failed her. They walked back into the council chamber in silence. The gallery had been cleared, only essential witnesses remained. King Cassian stood at the prosecution table, his face a mask of cold rage barely held in check. Solicitor Kale waited at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but Morella saw the tension in his shoulders. The 7 elders filed back to their seats with the slow, inexorable gravity of a funeral procession. Chief Elder's face revealed nothing as she settled into her chair and lifted a single piece of parchment. The council has reached a decision. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. This matter required examination of laws dating back 7 centuries, legal precedents that have shaped the foundation of coven governance, and the fundamental question of what constitutes legitimate family structure within our society. Morella couldn't breathe. Valen's grip on her hand tightened until it hurt. King Cassian's petition argued that Lady Morella Corvash lacks legal standing as a parent due to her rejected status and failure to produce biological heirs. The petition further claimed that the 4 scions in question represent political liabilities due to their association with dissolved houses. The chief elder paused, her ancient eyes sweeping across the chamber. However, after careful review of historical precedent, expert testimony, and the documentation presented by the defense, this council finds that House Corvash was legally established 3 years prior to this petition, following all protocols for the creation of a new noble house through integration of unclaimed bloodlines. A strangled sound escaped Morella's throat. Furthermore, the elder continued, the evidence presented by Dr. Isla Thorne regarding systemic bloodline failure, combined with testimony from Elder Casimir, demonstrates that Lady Morella's actions, while unconventional, represent a pragmatic response to institutional neglect that has resulted in the extinction of 63 noble houses. Cassian's hands gripped the table, his knuckles white. Therefore, the council rules that custody of Princes Darien, Orion, Lucien, and Valen Corvash remains with Lady Morella Corvash, recognized founder and matriarch of House Corvash. The chief elder's gaze found Morella's. However, given the political complexity of integrating 4 scions from dissolved houses into active nobility, the following modifications are required. House Corvash will be placed under coven oversight for a period of 5 years, during which the princes will receive formal training in coven law, history, and diplomatic protocol. At the end of this period, House Corvash will be eligible for full recognition and political standing. Morella's knees buckled. Darien caught her, his arms wrapping around her with fierce, protective strength. Around them, she heard Orion's choked gasp, Lucien's whispered curse of relief, and felt Valen's tears against her shoulder. They had won. Not completely. Not without conditions. But they had won. The chief elder wasn't finished. Additionally, House Corvash will be granted protection under the Coven's ancient ward system, the same protections afforded to all recognized noble houses. Any attempt to separate this family unit without council approval will be considered a violation of Coven law. The gavel struck once, final and absolute. King Cassian turned and walked out of the chamber without a word, his rage a palpable thing trailing behind him like smoke. Morella didn't watch him go. She was too busy holding her sons, all 4 of them surrounding her in a fierce embrace that felt like the only real victory she'd ever needed. 3 weeks later, Morella stood on the training grounds behind their estate, watching her sons move through combat drills with the precision of a family that had learned to fight as one. The Coven's ward markers glowed faint silver at the property boundaries, ancient protective magic that now recognized House Corvash as legitimate, permanent, real. Darien directed the exercise with military efficiency, correcting Valen's stance while Orion and Lucian sparred with blades that caught the afternoon light. They were beautiful and deadly, and hers not through blood, not through fate, but through the most powerful magic of all, deliberate, defiant choice. Solicitor Kale appeared at her side, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. The first formal training session with the Coven Scholars starts next week. Are they ready? They will be. Morella smiled, and it was genuine, unguarded. They've survived worse than stuffy academics. And you? Kale studied her. The woman who walked into that council chamber isn't the same one who was rejected 3 years ago. No, Morella agreed quietly. She's not. That woman believed her worth was measured by what she could give a king. This woman knows her worth is measured by the family she chose to build. In the training yard, Valen landed a successful strike against Darien, and his brother's cheers echoed across the grounds. Morella watched them with her heart full, no longer the broken consort, no longer defined by rejection or shame. She was Lady Morella Corvash, matriarch, mother, founder of a house built on loyalty stronger than blood. And she had finally come home. What do you think about the story? Share your lessons from the story. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. We post new stories every day, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.